All right, welcome everyone. This is the podcast from Chris and Jesse for U.S. history. And in this podcast, we are going to talk about living conditions in the U.S. during the Progressive Era and modern day and some of the issues that relate with both of those times. So if we're looking back on the Progressive Era, the primary problem with housing was poor living conditions in the cities. And within the cities, there were many problems. First of all, most people living in the cities were immigrants coming from Europe, so they didn't really know what to expect when arriving here, and they didn't know that their living conditions would be so bad, so they were forced into the situation. And that situation included very poor pay, sometimes 15 cents an hour with long work weeks, so they couldn't afford any kind of better living conditions or housing. So they were forced to live in these packed tenement buildings with a bunch of people crammed into these small rooms, and the quality was very poor. The close quarters also caused many diseases to spread quickly, such as tuberculosis and others, and there wasn't any kind of good healthcare there, so these diseases could spread all throughout. There wasn't really any sewage or plumbing system that was of any good quality back then also, which also caused disease to spread. And all around, these living conditions were very poor, on top of a lot of prejudice coming from people towards these immigrants who lived in these terrible cities. And honestly, this was all to kind of set up by the owners of these homes who just wanted to make an extra penny off of these immigrants for their housing.
So when the progressives saw the living conditions of these poor families, they took matters into their own hands. The approaches and solutions that they took to try to help resolve these issues was they try to help poor people by improving working and living conditions. And their solution to that was police. They set up police and firefighting systems that were set up in many urban areas. And reformers added parks and better transportation in urban life to make it more pleasant. Another approach that they took was they urged cities to pass legislation which set up standards for housings. And so there was a social workforce called the female social work, which formed settlements which help aid immigrant families. And these were called whole houses. So for the families that were kind of thrown out of their houses or had nowhere else to go, just living on the streets, they had a place to go, which was called a hold house, like I said. And so it was basically like they fed them food and they gave them proper care and they gave them shots and stuff so they wouldn't get diseases and it wouldn't spread and cause their life to be at risk. And so one of the biggest problems that the progressives had was the quality of the meat that was being sold to the public. And so they knew that once they saw how bad and how disgusting the quality of the meat was, they had to take an action and they had to do something about it. And so what they did was they got the food FDA approved, which was an incredibly huge deal because before it was FDA approved, the people who were selling the meat in the factories, if the meat was like filled with diseases, they didn't care. They still chopped it up and they still put it in packages and they still sold it to the public. And this was a huge outbreak in diseases like what Chris said, like tuberculosis and many other diseases that were caused because of the terrible meat condition. And this was a huge deal to the progressives. And one of the bad things was that the people who were eating these meat, they didn't even care. All they cared about was that they were getting their meat and that they were eating food because they were so poor. They didn't care how bad or how disease-filled that these foods were. So when the progressives got the food FDA approved, it was, like I said, a huge deal because before the meat would be put out on the streets and before people would buy them, there was a company that would inspect the meat and make sure that the quality is perfect so that people won't get diseases anymore and so that it won't have a huge outbreak like it did before the FDA was approved.
So looking back on the situation as a whole, fixing up these living conditions was a very important moment in American history because it inspired more people to try and achieve their American dream and brought more people into the country because they knew that they would have a good place to live, actually. and it also set it up so that people would have a better quality of life and would be treated fairly also. So, the pros of this are abundant. There was better pay, better health. Cities were set up better. There wasn't quite as much greed, like in the tenements. And while there's not really many cons, unless you're siding with some of these business owners that were taking advantage of these many people living in these poor cities, but this was a very crucial and important moment in American history that had to happen at some point in order to improve the quality of life of many citizens living in the United States. Although the progressives solved many issues with living conditions in cities, though there's still new emerging problems that exist in the 21st century. And one of these main issues is gentrification, which is the process by which middle-class people move into deteriorated inner-city neighborhoods and renovate the housing. And this is a problem for the original residents of these neighborhoods because they're being priced out by wealthier people that are moving into the area. And a lot of cities encourage this by providing low-cost loans and tax breaks to the people who choose to renovate these inner-city homes, because these cities would like for them to have higher quality homes. But by having new people with money move into these areas, they're fixing it up and the cities don't have to do anything about it. So they greatly encourage it. And it's criticized as being a subsidy for the middle class at the expense of the people with lower incomes, which in a way it is if poor people are being priced out of these areas because they can't afford to pay the tax on the land or rent prices for people who own it. And some people also claim that people of color can be discriminated through gentrification because many of the neighborhoods that gentrification is occurring in are typically neighborhoods where a lot of people of color in, and they think that they're almost being targeted in a way by people who want to fix up the area. So, as I said before, some people think that gentrification is a positive, and as it's a boost to the local economy, and new businesses love to move into these areas because the land's initially cheap, but then by moving there, they raise the price. So it's really, it's about ethics a little bit, because the neighborhood will improve in quality and the economy will be boosted, but it's at the expense of these poor people who have been living there for such a long time. So we have to really think about what's more important, these people or businesses. And that's the problem that many people making policies in the government and other laws have to think about before making these important decisions.
When modern-day groups see gentrification as a rising problem in their community, which is still going on today, they do whatever they can to help resolve this problem and at least try to regulate the expansion of wealthy people into their neighborhoods. And they also try to limit the amount of money that was being spent onto these houses, which would then jack up the prices and would eventually force these people who were previously living in these houses out and essentially make them homeless and living on the streets. With all these people outrageous, so these people who previously lived in these houses were outraged by the wealthy people coming over and trying to take over their land and try to remodel and try to jack up the prices. So these people that previously lived in these homes went to the government and were outraged at them and try to make them take action on this cause that was happening in their neighborhoods. And the government had proposed issues to these solutions, and one of them was reducing and freeze property taxes to protect these long-time residents. And that way they could still afford to keep their homes and not have to be thrown out into the street. Another proposed solution was to prohibit the large-scale luxury development in these at-risk neighborhoods in order to keep these prices low in their neighborhoods and for them to still be able to afford their rent. With many of these people happy by the proposed solutions that they were told, none of it really ever happened, and most of them were thrown out onto the streets or couldn't afford their rent. It was also very hard for the people to regulate the size of these businesses and these corporations because the government supported these corporations, which made it even more difficult to stop their actions and what they were doing. Therefore, causing a lot of people forcing them out of their houses and making thousands of people outraged.
So gentrification, in conclusion, is a very controversial topic, and there are many pros and cons to it. Some of the pros include that it will boost the economy in the neighborhood and increase the quality of the homes there and living, but is all at the expense of the original people living there, which are the cons, that it pretty much kicks people out of their original neighborhoods, and there aren't really any programs set up to help these people once they're gone. So overall, in my opinion, I believe gentrification is a bad thing unless it is done right, which means there needs to be programs to help support these people if they're going to be priced out of their homes. And they need to know where they're going and have a plan set up. And that falls on the government for creating a system or a group or a program, an organization that will help give these people their knowledge on what they should do and how they should approach this situation. But when it comes to the grand scheme of things, we do want to improve the quality of our cities and the quality of life around. So, I mean, it's very controversial, but there just needs to be a program set up to help people who are affected by gentrification if this process is to continue in the future. Otherwise, it should be prevented because it's just hurting people. So, in conclusion, if we look at the past, during the progressive era, the present day, and even the future, there's always going to seem to be issues in society. But if there's one thing we can take away, that it's important to take action on this and take a stand for what you believe is right and to really do what you think is best for the good of the people.
Yeah, and don't have individual greed outweigh the lives of many people. Because if you support the wealthy people, the actions that you do will make many lives suffer. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Jesse and Chris. Hope you guys enjoy.